We journalists are not really in the business of predicting future. And nor should anyone else, because none of us has a crystal ball. But tonight, we will take a look at the map of the world and try to answer the question, what will 2025 be all about? Good evening and Happy New Year. My name is Mateusz Mazzini and this is Wider View, welcoming you for the first time in 2025. Last week, we read the final credits for 2024. It was the year of anti-incumbency, populist electoral victories, and escalations in almost all military conflicts. But it's not a given that all of these trends will persist in 2025. Elections will be held in some of the most important democracies on the planet, but many of them without a clear frontrunner. Fears of an all-out global war will grow, but it's difficult to guess where violence could erupt next. Artificial intelligence will face a moment of truth in terms of its real impact on the economy. And we're entering a critical year for climate change action, as well as resistance against populism. What should you keep an eye on in 2025? We tried to map the key challenges in our report.
In 2025, a lot of grandiose political projects will face the reality of practical implementation. Donald Trump has promised to wall off the US economy with tariffs against almost every trade partner. That's likely to trigger a domino effect, as Europe and China could respond in kind. As a result, the future of the international trade system, based on relatively unregulated commerce between states, will be put to the test. The same fate awaits the multilateral rules-based order, as threats to international institutions will continue to grow. The European Union will most likely experience increasing internal turbulence, as more countries experience a rightward shift. With elections in Germany and almost certain political turmoil in France, Europe's center of gravity might move elsewhere. Given Russia's further imperialist advances, officials in Brussels and Washington will have their eyes on Eastern Europe. Politicians from the region, including Kaja Kallas and Donald Tusk, might therefore play a greater role in determining the EU's strategy. 2025 will also bring about a make-or-break moment for Europe's common foreign policy. As conflicts erupt almost everywhere in EU's neighborhood, Brussels will need to develop a response that has some teeth. Elsewhere, countries will have to face significant structural challenges. Aging societies will be on everybody's minds, especially since no public policy has proven to be a solution so far. Hopes are high that artificial intelligence will produce a breakthrough that actually changes the lives of millions. At the same time, concerns are mounting over the lack of regulatory frameworks and the growing power of big tech companies. 2025 will also be a litmus test for democratic resilience.
Take over, Elon!
Donald Trump and a few other leaders will try to move the center of decision-making to the private sector. The developments in his partnership with Elon Musk will be watched by millions, especially since they have many conflicting interests. Energy transition, climate policy, and China are only the most important contentious points in this relationship.
La question est la suivante plutôt.
Australians and Canadians will go to the polls to elect new governments. More countries will debate the rights of women, minorities, and even the right to die unassisted. The American progressive movement is off on a deep soul-searching journey as Trump 2.0 takes shape. We are also likely to see major advancements in energy storage, autonomous weapons, and even space exploration. 2025 begins with a lot of uncertainty inherited from its predecessor. And it is highly unlikely that even the most pressing global problems will be solved over the next 12 months. But there is one thing we already know for sure. 2025 will be many things. One thing it certainly won't be is boring.
How many of our worries from 2024 are going to continue into the new year? Where should we look for hope? and which parts of the map will be marked by fear and violence? Who will have the upper hand, the populists or the Liberal Democrats? These questions are as important as they are difficult to answer. But let's see how our guests deal with them tonight. And I'm pleased to say, joining me are Andrew Mueller, host of the Foreign Desk podcast at Monocle Radio, and Nina dos Santos, broadcaster and journalist, former Europe editor at CNN, and I'm pleased to say, a regular on our show. Good evening both, and welcome to Wider View. And I want to begin with you, Nina, with something that could extend potentially from 2024 into 2025. The last year saw incumbents losing power in almost every major democracy. We saw politicians from the left, politicians from the right, even centrists being swept away from the office. Next year, some of the world's major democracies, including Germany, Canada, are also going to face elections. Do you think anti-incumbency will persist in 2025?
Well, first thing I'd add to your statement there is that it wasn't just democratically elected leaders who were turfed out of office. One of the big surprises at the end of 2024, of course, was the fall of the Assad regime into its second generation there that had dominated the political sphere in Syria for 55 years. And of course, that will have a huge implication for how things fare in the Middle East in 2025. But as you quite rightfully point out, Mateusz, 2024 was the year of elections. 2025 appears to be the year of questions, because the question is, how will some of these new leaders in these big parts of the world decide to govern? Some of them are people who we already know, like Donald Trump, who've come back into office, and coming with him will be a whole host of corporate interests and potential conflicts of interest there. But there are other question marks over how new leaders that could be coming in Latin America might fare, also in parts of Africa. And there'll be big political changes afoot in Europe, notably in the biggest economy inside the EU, which is, of course, Germany. It's going to be going to the polls in snap elections in February after its government crumbled towards the end of 2024. And it's looking likely that Christian Democrats, the conservative centre-right parties of Angela Merkel's days, will now grab the political mantle, although they might not get a full majority. Question is who they'll govern with. We'll have to see. But they will be coming in with all sorts of far more right-wing influenced policies than we've seen in years gone by.
So we're going to come back to Europe later on in that discussion, but right now over to you, Andrew, and your home country, Australia and the broader Australia and Southeast Asia Pacific region. Do you think that this particular part of the world is also likely to see a major eruption of violence and military conflicts of any sorts? Fears are definitely growing about that possibility, but do you think that there will be any place, any position on the map of that world that could actually see a direct military conflict?
Australia, no, I don't think so. A great many things would need to go wrong for that to happen, and that is, of course, Australia's great geographical blessing. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, it would be a confident person who made certain predictions about that. As Nina was pointing out, referring to Syria, things can happen extremely quickly. And they tend to happen very quickly where tyrannies and dictatorships are concerned. They always look completely invincible right up until the moment they don't exist anymore, and the dictator is skipping to the nearest country with no extradition treaty, with as much of the national treasury as he can fit on his private jet. The outsider possibility is always in Southeast Asia, same next year as everywhere, North Korea. That is a dictatorship which has looked as absolutely impermeable, impenetrable, and immovable as, for example, the Assad regime in Syria for nearly as long. My suspicion is that will be one of those things where one day we will wake up, turn on the news, and it just won't be there anymore, and no one will be entirely certain why. That is, of course, the challenge that faces policymakers dealing with these things, that quite often things just happen. No one's really sure why they happened. And as we are seeing in these early weeks of 2025 with Syria, it then just becomes a process of scrambling to catch up.
Quite an optimistic, I must say, prediction that we have here on Andrew Mueller. Similar question to you, Nina, but about the Middle East and kind of like a broader bird's eye view on military conflicts all over the world. Do you think that somewhere on the map of the world, beyond Ukraine and beyond the broader Middle Eastern region, there could be a conflict erupting that we don't know about yet that would actually warrant or justify us saying that we do, in fact, live in the age of World War III?
Well, I think the big question over what indeed could bring about World War III and whether or not our generation is facing it or could be facing the preamble to it has dominated the agenda, not just since the October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel, but also since the onset of the war in Ukraine. You could even argue that the roots of this conversation go way back since Vladimir Putin decided to invade territories in Georgia and then later on take Crimea from Ukraine. So this has, been in the back of people's minds for quite some time. But what's changed the dynamic a bit is that we now have a number of failed states on the geopolitical map. You're thinking about, for instance, Libya, which since we saw Colonel Gaddafi's demise has essentially become a failed state. Syria has become a failed narco state over the last 13 years of its civil war. And the question now will be, what happens to big countries that backed places like Syria, like, for instance, Iran? What happens to countries like Russia that backed Syria and now need to find another sort of port of influence somewhere in the Mediterranean from where they can launch all of their influence and commodity grabbing operations across the African continent? Lots of things on the chessboard are changing geopolitically in 2025. Does it mean that there'll be a broader escalation? Well, possibly not, because hopefully when it comes to Ukraine, Donald Trump seems to claim that he will be able to find some impasse and convince Ukraine that he can find some settlement that they might be amenable to. Even if it might be a bitter pill to swallow. So Ukraine might come back from the brink. But when it comes to the Middle East, that is a part of the world that I think we should be deeply worried about in 2025, because there's lots of moving parts.
Well, Donald Trump, as you rightly pointed out, claims many things about many places all over the planet, and whether that reflects the true state of affairs, that remains to be seen. But on that note, Andrew, let's actually talk about the big elephant in the room, Donald Trump himself. How much of the American Trumpian or the American populist promise do you think will actually translate into tangible results? He promised many things, especially in the world of trade, but at the same time, we all know Donald Trump is a serial bankrupt who doesn't really have a track record of delivering too much on his promise. So will he deliver this time round?
Well, it will result in tangible results, but whether they're the tangible results that Donald Trump intends or his voters wanted is a whole other question. It's going to be weirder this time even than the first time, I think. The first time, as is now well understood, possibly because he didn't really understand how power works and how government functions, he surrounded himself with relative grown-ups. And a lot of those people, I think he surrounded himself with because he believed that it made him look cool. The generals in particular, the burly men with the stars on their shoulders, I think he thought their authority reflected upon him. I think he's now under no illusions whatsoever as to what those men with the stars on their shoulders actually think of him. So there won't be that many restraining elements around him this time. So it will be Trump unleashed. Now, there's not many reasons to be tremendously optimistic about that. One potentially is that everybody else is so unnerved by the fact that he could wake up tomorrow and decide to do more or less anything, that the rest of the world might organize itself better, that the rest of the world might have heeded, Europe especially, the warning of Trump 1.0, i.e. that whether there's more Trumps or less Trumps in future, Europe needs to stop taking the United States for granted. Europe needs to start thinking for itself. And you can kind of hope, as we sort of saw during Trump's first term in the United States, in the midterms in particular, that there is there's an answering backlash. There is a response from progressive elements in the United States thinking, okay, we do need to organize ourselves. We do need to make a case. We do need to take the fight to this person and what he represents. And you did see in those midterms, and I think in subsequent elections, you are seeing not necessarily nationwide, but statewide and locally across the United States, you're seeing more women running for office, more people of color running for office, more people of various possibly threatened minorities running for office, because you get to people thinking, well, if not now, then when? And if not me, then who? So I don't personally think there's a great deal of optimism to be had about the prospect of Donald Trump's second term, but there's some optimism, I think, available in what the restoration of Trump might prompt by way of response.
Picking up on what you said, Andrew, and now over to you, Nina. The big question, I think, about 2025 is the question about American leadership in foreign affairs. We saw that already towards the end of 2024 when Donald Trump, and I think the right verb for that is he truth socialed, as opposed to tweeting, that what's happening in Syria is none of America's business, and Syria is not a friend of America, so we should stay out of this. He will certainly be trying to stay out of everything. But my question to you, Nina, is will he succeed in staying out?
Well, I think what we know about Donald Trump's future presidency is that it's going to be highly transactional. It's also going to be highly commercial. And so what does Donald Trump really have to gain from helping to rebuild a country like Syria, for instance? Well, not a huge amount, because Turkey, for instance, and its big construction companies will probably hoover up a lot of that business. And also, Donald Trump has made it very clear that he's on the side of Israel as well. So I think he'll probably leave Syria to its own devices. There's not a huge amount of leverage for him to gain there. But there are other parts of the world that he's definitely very committed to being rather disruptive on, notably his relationship with the EU. And it has alarmed many in this huge bloc of more than 400 million people, one of the biggest customer markets anywhere in the world, that Donald Trump could, heaven forbid, moot 10% tariffs on their goods and services. This has, the new European Union Commission that's just took up its mandate after Ursula von der Leyen got a second term. It only kicked back into action on the 1st of December after all of her commission got through the vetting process. And the first thing they're having to do is thinking about how, as Andrew was saying before, to shore up Europe's security without the US footing the bill for that anymore, particularly in places like Germany and further to the east in Europe. And also, the other thing they have to think about is shoring up their own business model. If they export so much to the United States and it's going to slap tariffs on, that'll probably prompt countries like the EU's members to do the same. And so you could end up with this ratcheting of a trade war that Donald Trump seems to think his country will be best placed to win. Remember, its economy is a lot stronger than anywhere else in the Western world at the moment.
Not to be forgotten, but you both seem to be navigating in this discussion towards Europe, so let's tackle that issue now. And question to you, Andrew, about the changing nature, the changing balance of power in Europe. In the absence of this traditional leadership on the Franco-German axis, will the center of political gravity move somewhere else in Europe? So in other words, who are your ones to watch in 2025 that could, paraphrasing Donald Trump, make Europe great again?
I'm honestly not saying this just because of which channel we're broadcasting on. I do think Poland is potentially Europe's coming power. And partly
we'll take note of that.
Partly that is because nobody else really seems to want the job. Germany, which should fulfill that role, has spent decades trying to avoid fulfilling that role. And that is partly because of Germany's nervousness and squeamishness about aspects of its own history, though I for one, think it is long past time Germany got over itself in that respect. And there also is the fact that France cannot necessarily be relied upon much past the next few years either in terms of a defensive bulwark for Europe against further Russian aggression. Emmanuel Macron is term limited. He cannot run again for president in 2027. It is far from impossible that France's next president will be, if not Marine Le Pen, then somebody with similar predilections, somebody with a more isolationist view, somebody much more amenable to dealing with Russia. The United Kingdom hopefully will play a greater role, but it did circumscribe itself 8 years ago by voting to leave the European Union. Poland, given its position in Europe, given the size of its population, the potential of its population and its economy, and the fact that its government clearly gets what it's up against, I think is extremely perfectly positioned. Poland is a country which is talking about spending 5% of its GDP on defense. It does recognize that it is the obvious easternward bulwark for Europe just because of where it is and the size it is. And I don't see any reason why Poland could not aspire to at least as big a say in Europe's future direction, and not just in terms of defense, as either Germany or France or Italy or Spain. I mean, I think it is absolutely there for the taking for Poland.
We will revisit that prediction at the end of 2025. But on that note, the final question to you, Nina. Let's narrow down what we discussed with Andrew to one particular person, and that person is Kaja Kallas, the former Prime Minister of Estonia, now the brand new head of the External Action Service, the European Union Diplomatic Force. Will she be more successful than her predecessors in bringing some teeth and muscle to European foreign policy?
Well, somebody said she'd have had a bigger role had she been granted the top job at NATO to be able to do that. But that was viewed as being a bit too provocative to Russia at a time when obviously NATO doesn't want to poke the Russian bear any further. But yes, you're right. In terms of foreign policy, it was a sort of bold move to give the Baltic countries a prominent position. And by the way, she's not the only Baltic politician and Prime Minister at that who got a chance to get a seat at the top table inside the EU. You can also think of Lithuania's Kubilius as well, who's going to be in charge of a big defence portfolio that's been newly created with extra money for beefing up the coffers of Europe's much depleted arsenal, that now that they realise they're going to have to sort of band together and defend Europe's eastern border on their own without quite as much American help under Donald Trump's administration, they realise that they have to put their money where their mouth is and also put manufacturing where their mouth is. And so having more prominent voices from the Baltic countries, who really at the end of the day are NATO and the EU's front line here. They've been dealing with all sorts of hybrid warfare that doesn't just involve weaponry as well. Remember that Belarus weaponized immigration against a country like, okay, maybe not Estonia, where Kaja Kallas comes from, but Lithuania over there as well. And now, if the situation in Syria becomes tense and you have waves of more migration, or there's a bad peace deal in Ukraine, and again, you have more migration coming from these parts of the world, it'll be the eastern countries in Europe that'll have to defend their borders from these sort of hybrid attacks where migration and other issues like cyber attacks are used to kind of test NATO's mettle and the EU's fortitude as well.
We made some bold predictions for 2025, so let's store them safely now, revisit them in 12 months and see how well we did. Nina Santos and Andrew Mueller were our guests tonight. Thank you for joining us and have a good evening. History seems to be constantly accelerating, and there is no time to waste in reporting on it. There are very few things we can say for certain about the months to come, with perhaps one exception. International affairs have become truly international now. And to fully understand global politics, you need to pay attention to all parts of the planet, with no exceptions. Thank you for being with us tonight, and throughout the whole last year. Next week, we will begin the second season of Wider View, and we promise to be bringing you insights from all over, especially from places less explored. Make sure you're with us next week, and have a good evening.